Released in 1985 for the Nintendo Entertainment System, Kung Fu is a game that holds a special place in the hearts of early gamers as one of the earliest examples of the beat-em-up genre. Known for its simple yet addictive gameplay and martial arts-inspired action, Kung Fu was not just a fun experience. It was also an important game that influenced many side-scrolling action titles that followed. Originally based on an arcade game, Kung Fu on the NES was one of the early titles that helped to define the system's library, becoming a foundational part of many players' gaming memories. Kung Fu began as an arcade game called Kung Fu Master, developed by Irem and released in 1984. It was directed by legendary designer Takashi Nishiyama, who later went on to work on iconic games like Street Fighter and Fatal Fury. In fact, Kung Fu Master is often considered one of the precursors to the fighting game genre, as it established many of the mechanics that would later evolve into more complex fighting systems. The arcade version was inspired by Bruce Lee's martial arts films, particularly Game of Death, which featured a plotline about fighting through multiple levels, each with its own unique enemies and bosses. The game also drew inspiration from the popular 1984 martial arts movie Wheels on Meals, starring Jackie Chan, which featured a scene of intense martial arts action inside a multi-level building. This cinematic influence is obvious in the game's structure, as players battled their way through floors of enemies in a pagoda-like tower. Kung Fu Master was a hit in arcades, and it wasn't long before Nintendo saw the potential of bringing the game to their home console, the NES. The game was adapted for the NES by Irem in partnership with Nintendo, and it was simply titled Kung Fu for the home console version. Released in 1985, it was one of the NES launch titles in North America, helping to solidify the system's early success. The story of Kung Fu is simple, in line with most games of its time, but it gets straight to the point and serves as a classic martial arts setup. Players take on the role of Thomas, a martial artist who must fight his way through the 5 floors of the mysterious Devil's Temple to rescue his kidnapped girlfriend Sylvia from the clutches of the evil crime boss, Mr. X. Each floor of the temple is guarded by waves of henchmen, various types of enemies, and a powerful boss. The plot may be minimal, but it fits perfectly within the framework of the game, providing just enough motivation to get players engaged in the action. The storyline is heavily influenced by martial arts films from the 1970s and 1980s, where a lone hero must fight their way through hordes of enemies to rescue someone or defeat a powerful villain. The game doesn't focus much on developing its narrative beyond the initial setup, but the structure, ascending through floors to face off against different enemies, creates a sense of progression and urgency as Thomas inches closer to rescuing Sylvia. Kung Fu is a side-scrolling beat-em-up that focuses on fast-paced, skill-based combat. The game is fairly straightforward, but its simplicity is part of what makes it so enjoyable. Players control Thomas as he fights his way through waves of enemies across 5 floors of the Devil's Temple. The game uses 2 basic attack buttons, one for punches and one for kicks. Players can punch or kick at 3 different heights, low, medium, and high, depending on the enemies they're facing. While punches are faster and can stun enemies quickly, kicks have a longer reach and deal more damage. Each floor introduces a variety of enemies that challenge the player in different ways. Common enemies include basic enemies that try to grab Thomas and drain his health, knife throwers. These enemies throw projectiles that must be dodged or blocked, requiring quick reflexes. Midget fighters, small, agile enemies who jump around and are difficult to hit. Dragons. Appearing later in the game, these serpentine enemies spit fire and add a fantastical element to the otherwise martial arts-focused game. Boss fights. At the end of each floor, Thomas must face off against a boss character. Each boss has a unique fighting style, and players must figure out the right strategy to defeat them. For example, Stick Fighter. The first floor boss wields a large staff and has a longer reach. Boomerang Fighter, the second floor boss, throws boomerangs, adding a ranged element to the fight. Giant, the third floor boss, a huge enemy who relies on brute strength to overwhelm Thomas. Black Magician, the fourth floor boss, uses magic to attack, making him one of the trickier bosses to fight. Mr. X, the final boss. The mastermind behind the kidnapping, Mr. X is a formidable fighter and the ultimate test of Thomas's martial arts prowess. As Thomas ascends the temple, the difficulty increases. Enemies become faster, more numerous, and more challenging to defeat. Each floor feels distinct, with new enemy types and different obstacles to overcome. To advance to the next floor, players must clear all enemies and defeat the boss at the end of each level. To add to the challenge, each stage has a time limit. Players must defeat all enemies, and the boss before time runs out, or they lose a life. This creates a sense of urgency, forcing players to find a balance between speed and careful combat. Thomas has a health bar that depletes when he takes hits from enemies. If his health runs out, he loses a life, and players must restart from the beginning of the floor. The game also provides limited continues, making it a true test of skill to complete the game in one sitting. Kung Fu is one of the earliest examples of the beat-em-up genre, predating later classics like Double Dragon, Streets of Rage, and Final Fight. The game's simple yet effective combat mechanics helped lay the foundation for future beat-em-ups, which would expand on the concept with more complex moves, multiplayer features, and larger, more detailed environments. The development team behind Kung Fu included Takashi Nishiyama, who went on to design the original Street Fighter. Elements of Kung Fu's combat mechanics, such as the emphasis on timing, reflexes, and different types of attacks, can be seen as an early blueprint for the one-on-one fighting games that would follow in later years. As mentioned earlier, Kung Fu was heavily inspired by Bruce Lee's film Game of Death. In the film, Bruce Lee fights his way through a series of levels to face increasingly dangerous opponents, much like Thomas does in the game. This inspiration from martial arts cinema gave the game an authentic Kung Fu feel that resonated with players. In Japan, Kung Fu was originally released as Spartan X, a licensed game based on the movie Wheels on Meals, starring Jackie Chan. However, when the game was localized for Western audiences, the reference to Wheels on Meals was removed and it was rebranded as Kung Fu. This move likely helped the game achieve broader appeal, as it focused more on the general theme of martial arts rather than a specific movie tie-in. Kung Fu was one of the first NES games to be released in North America as part of the system's initial lineup. It was included among the black box games, early titles with a distinctive cover art style that set the standard for NES packaging. The game's presence at the NES launch helped establish it as a must-play title for early adopters, and it became one of the most successful games on the platform. While Kung Fu may not have had direct sequels, its influence can be seen in many later games that adopted its formula. The straightforward combat mechanics, simple controls, and boss battles would inspire countless action games and beat-em-ups in the years to come. In particular, the idea of fighting through a series of levels, each culminating in a boss fight, became a staple of the genre. Like many NES classics, Kung Fu has gained a following in the speedrunning community. Players compete to finish the game as quickly as possible, mastering its mechanics and optimizing strategies for defeating bosses and clearing levels efficiently. Kung Fu is a game that remains fondly remembered, not just for its gameplay, but also for the way it encapsulates the martial arts craze of the 1980s. During this time, Kung Fu movies were at their height of popularity, and the game's theme capitalized on that trend. Even today, the game is often mentioned when discussing the early days of the NES and the evolution of action games. Kung Fu for the NES may seem simple by today's standards, but it was a groundbreaking game when it was released. Its straightforward, fast-paced gameplay, coupled with its martial arts theme, made it a standout title in the NES launch lineup. The game's legacy as one of the first beat-em-ups, combined with its influence on later fighting games, ensures its place in gaming history. Though it lacks the depth of later action titles, Kung Fu remains a classic, not just for its nostalgic appeal, but also for the way it pioneered elements of game design that would become staples of the genre. Whether you're a retro gaming enthusiast or simply curious about the roots of beat-em-ups, Kung Fu is a must-play title that still delivers satisfying martial arts action decades after its release.